Welcome back, everyone, and welcome to our keynote session, Improving Legacy Applications with UX Design. In case you missed the previous session, my name is Michelle Rotan, and I'm your host today. For this session, I'm joined by guest presenter, Billy Hollis. Billy has been developing software for over 30 years and has acquired a worldwide reputation in software development, design, and architecture. As a developer and consultant, he has developed systems for healthcare, energy, telecommunications, and transportation. As an author, he has written or co-written 10 technology books and dozens of magazine articles. As a conference speaker, he's done over 500 sessions at major national and international conferences. Billy has also been a favorite speaker at past Synergex events, and he's worked with Synergex customers to help them improve their UI and UX.
Hi, everyone. Billy Hollis here, and I love talking to people who do software development about how to use UX design and design thinking to improve their applications. Since most of the Synergex community has legacy apps, some of which go back decades, I'd like to suggest some possibilities for applying UX design to legacy apps. I hope you'll get some good ideas and possibly be inspired to evolve your legacy apps with some significant improvements that users will like. Because we really do need to move past stuff like this. The problem is that the organization probably has millions invested in apps that look like this. They couldn't afford a total replacement even if they thought it was needed. They probably don't have either the time or the money. But modern technologies, especially UI and cloud, give us enormous potential to make apps better. So how can that be done without doing app replacement? These technologies allow us to enter an era of modern apps. Here's an example of a modern app from a Synergex customer that we worked with. But apps like this are generally done from scratch, most commonly when you need to change your UI platform and create a whole new front end. As I said earlier, in many cases, that's just not feasible. But if we can't start over and achieve an app like this, we can still apply technology and design to improve those legacy apps. This session gives you some tips on making that happen. First problem is that many people in the industry think design means visual and aesthetic design. They see this app and think it's the aesthetics that make it special. But this app is special because it was deliberately designed for things like data visualization and interaction. Legacy apps are not usually done that way. Even modern apps sometimes fall into the fallacy that design equals aesthetics. This type of design began fairly early in the web era. Aesthetic design came about because early websites were ugly. Programmers created them, so of course they were. But no one likes an ugly website, and companies soon learned that they could get more visits to their site with good aesthetics. Some visual designers also spend time getting layout right, and this can boost the user's understanding and productivity. Some of you, but probably not all of you, have done some of this type of work on your apps, especially if your app is hosted in a browser. It's a good start, but it only takes you so far. Focusing on aesthetic design for legacy apps means you're just putting cosmetics on a not very attractive app. That type of design very rarely results in significant innovation or even just speeding up the users. Those are more valuable than aesthetics. So what you should do instead is move up to a different level of design effort. To start, look at your app and find parts of it where you go, this piece needs to be better. That's usually parts that are used a lot or were done badly in the first place, or both. Search is a common candidate. Most business apps have search designed with a mentality from the 1990s. We'll look at other places this kind of design can be leveraged as well. The key is that we can do this kind of design in narrow, confined parts of the app without biting off a complete replacement. Once you've zeroed in on a part of the app that needs improvement, you'll need to go through a minimal process to design a new improved version. One of the reasons incremental design can get by with a minimal process is that you already know a lot about what that part of the app is supposed to do. You don't have to go through an extensive effort to understand the overall problem. But you do need to understand where the current views are falling short. The best place to find that out is by watching users doing real work with those views. I do a lot of user observation in my projects, and I'm constantly amazed at the things I see. For example, existing apps often have bugs for which users have a workaround, often a time-wasting one. But the real opportunities are where I see users taking way too long to do something that they have to do many, many times a day. It's almost always because the user interface of the view doesn't fit the way they think about their work. It probably made sense to the programmer who created the view, but it doesn't really make sense for the user and the way they actually do work. So a key part of this lightweight process is observing users to find out where there are opportunities to do better. Then, based on those possibilities, you can sketch possible better designs, get some feedback on them, and do that a few cycles until you have something you think is clearly better and that fits the user's jobs better. This normally doesn't take a long time. You might go through the design process for a replacement search view, say, in a day or two. That investment is well worth it because better design has many ways it can make your organization money. For legacy app improvement, the two largest ones are speeding up users and reducing their errors. You likely can't pin down exactly how much, but given a few reasonable assumptions, you can estimate it. I have a spreadsheet you can use for that. I don't have time to show it today, but you can contact me and I'll do a web meeting to apply it to your particular case, if you like. This kind of effort can be your entry point to introducing design thinking concepts and techniques to your team. One big reason is that you're not very likely to screw things up. You already have an app that works, so your worst case is that you fall back on how you're doing it now. The best case is a large measurable impact, plus some real improvement in user satisfaction. Plus, as I said, the investment is pretty low, a few days' time at most typically. There is usually not any need to twiddle with a budget to do this. The time frames are short enough and it fits within a normal maintenance effort well enough that it can be added without any noticeable disruption. Here are the parts of the typical legacy app that you should look at first for redesign possibilities. Some are easy. Emphasizing important information is mostly just knowing what's important and using a few common techniques for emphasis. Others are tougher, but all offer a good return for the investment made in them. Improving search, doing data visualizations to help users consume data, and improving workflow in your app can all have a strong productivity impact. Let's talk first about search. Any search capability created before Google, Yahoo, and Bing became prominent probably asks the user to search based on data fields. That made sense in the 1990s because of the limitations of databases in that era. But those limitations are mostly gone, and that kind of search mostly just hangs on through inertia. Now, this option does have more implications for back-end changes, but it's usually well worth it. Users understand it immediately, and it saves them time entering a search, which they do many, many times a day. A typical Google-style search looks something like this. The user just enters a search string. The search string might be in various fields, and the back-end logic must provide for that. If a search field is found in more than one field, then search results must be combined into a result set. Plus, most apps will still have a need for some kind of search that goes beyond just typing in a field. Searching a date range, for example, doesn't fit well with just entering in a search box, so you'll probably need an advanced search. However, you probably already have a fully functional search capability in the way that you do it now. So don't throw that away. Just put it as your advanced search, at least to start. The bigger design challenge is determining how you display results that are returned from the search. Today's search usually fills up a data grid, and for some apps that's perfectly sufficient. But modern UI allows formatting of information to make the list much easier to visually scan. Leveraging the visual system that way speeds up users and reduces frustration. Graphical symbols can be used to improve perception of important information. For example, if it's important to know who the doctors are in a results list, then you could display a symbol that everyone associates with a doctor. When redesigning search, don't forget, during your user interaction sessions, to find out what information the users need when they're scanning a list of results. If there's reference information they'll need occasionally, you can put that in a tooltip for a search result that only appears when they hover over an item. Putting search results in data grids does have some nice benefits. Sorting and filtering are generally pretty easy to implement, for example. But you can add capabilities to search results on a list like this one, such as a drop-down for the sort field. I'll show you an example in a moment. Different roles or different steps in a workflow might need search results to be displayed differently. That's not easy in older technologies, but if you're using more modern UI, you can provide multiple templates for search result. That kind of variation is almost never done in a data grid and would be limited in any event. So it's another reason to consider listing your results in list views or card views if your technology allows it. I'll show it as part of my demo in a moment. For both search and more advanced data visualization, which we're going to be taking up in a few moments, layering and shapes are underused capabilities. Any GUI platform allows some of this, but modern native UI stacks and web browsers offer a wide array of capabilities for layering and shapes. Few applications use them now. That's again mostly from inertia. When you start using shapes, if possible, use vector-based shapes instead of bitmaps. For web front ends, that usually means SVG format. There are libraries of these shapes you can get so that you don't have to create them yourself. I use a free one called Metro Studio. Let me show it quickly. So here's Metro Studio. Up in the box, there's a box up in the upper right that you can use as a search box. And if you put something in there, you'll get shapes that correspond to that category. Here's one for the cow's face, for example. There's another one right there that we actually used in a real application by a Synergex client that they do cattle management software. If you go to that shape, you've got the ability to change things, such as what background shape do you use and what background color do you use. So right now there's a circle, but it's transparent, so that if we were to change that, then we get a white background color. And once you've got everything kind of the way you want it, then you go to this area for what it calls code, and over there is the SVG version of that shape. All you would do is grab this and go paste it into your HTML page. Now I'd like to show a short demo showing a lot of these things I've talked about with search combined into one demonstration. I did this for a client about 13 years ago just to help them to see what some of the possibilities were with modern UI technologies. In this demo, you can see some of those layered graphics capabilities that I talked about. To be a bit whimsical, I included a face that can be either smiley or frowny, depending upon a customer's satisfaction index, which if you hover, you can see. That one's got 98, and this one's got minus something. Let's see if I can find it. Minus 94. And then layered on top of that is that physician symbol that I used before. And then some of the items have this layered symbol on top that indicates that they're an important customer, a top 10 customer. We've also got the time since the last contact, but we don't do that with the date. I mean, that's what's in the database, is the date, the last time you talked to them. But instead, what the user needs to see, since they don't care about the date, they want to know how long it's been, so we display how long it's been in days or months or years. I mentioned that you could do a sort drop down, so we can resort this by company name and get all the people from Acme Roadrunner Traps at the top there. You can also put some special capabilities for special searches that users might need on a very common basis. Let me position my little arrow there and take a look. For example, we could say, well, we only want doctors and we only want unhappy doctors. Maybe we want to check out our unhappy doctors and see what they're thinking and contact them. And now we've got a list of unhappy doctors. You can see everybody in the list is both a doctor and is unhappy. This drop down in the upper right is the way to change the way search results are displayed. You can change it as radically as you like. I'm just going to show a simple common alternative, which is a nice compact view of the data. So I hope that's given you a bit of insight into the alternatives for displaying search results. Of course, how much of this you can do depends on the front-end technology you're using now, as I mentioned earlier. There is one additional point worth making about doing a generic Google-style search. When you display results, the results might be from several different entities and need different ways to display them. One of the best approaches to address that is to provide multiple lists of returned items, one list for each entity. A customer might be named Howard, a product might be from a company named Howard Enterprises, and a delivery could be to an address on Howard Street. Displaying a list for each entity makes it easy to display that entity within its own format. Here's a simple wireframe illustrating the concept with the lists for customers and products and deliveries, all of which could be returned from a single search. If you use this approach, you may want to allow some kind of tear-off to grab a list and work on that list alone. If a user came to the search knowing that they were only interested in working with products, then they could get rid of the clutter of the other lists and focus just on products. The wireframe includes a symbol for that. Let me grab my blue arrow to show it. There, and there, and there. And what that would presumably do is to place the list in a different tab in the browser or a different window on the desktop. Another way of doing this would be to have something like checkboxes for each entity to exclude or include them. Now let's talk a bit about emphasizing important information. This can be done just about anywhere. Search results, a data entry screen, status screen, or whatever. It's an easy way to start thinking about better design. Typically, a view in an app has 4 to 6 pieces of information that the user needs to use to decide what to do on that view. So they look at those the most. Ideally, those pieces of information should be easy to find without scanning through other clutter that they aren't interested in. Once you know what those 4 to 6 pieces typically are, you can then work on ways to make that information easier to see. An experimental, iterative approach works well for this. Some of the possibilities to use to make something stand out is to simply make it bigger, that is, usually increase the font size. You can also use color to signal, though you'll want to keep that color subtle. Don't use primary colors except for things like danger alarms. Just a little bit of variation is easy for the eyes to pick up. The key is, as I said, understanding what those important pieces of information are for the view. And some kind of user interview or other interaction is typically necessary to find that out. Keep in mind that some views are used by different roles, and the important information may vary with the role. As I said, this is a great way to get started. It's a useful approach to start learning how to talk to users and try out different approaches with feedback along the way. It can also help loosen your team up from the typical patterns in legacy apps, where pretty much all the information is the same size and color. Oh, I almost forgot to mention, in addition to bigger font sizes and using color changes, making something bold is a good way to make it stand out. The principles of making information stand out are part of the larger topic of data visualization. So you'll see examples as we discuss that next. That's why I don't have any examples on this screen. Data visualization is used in various places in applications, but it's particularly important for various kinds of decision support, where users need to make decisions based on the data. For that, you need to do more than just make information stand out. You also sometimes need to help the user see multiple key pieces of information in relation to one another. We saw a brief example of this in the demonstration of search that I did a few slides back, demonstrating the layering of multiple information-driven graphics in a small space, combining a smiley face with symbols for other pieces of data. The thrust is that you're trying to leverage the user's visual system to see data more quickly and completely. Shapes and color are much faster for the user to perceive than text, and the real world doesn't neatly separate everything out into its own little box, so combining pieces of information does not slow down perception as long as you don't overdo it and make things too crowded. Many routine data visualizations can be done with standard types of charts, and you may be doing some of that already. In that case, standard tools make that pretty easy to implement. So, since you're likely already well-versed in that type of data visualization, I'll focus on going beyond that. There may be places in your app where a more specific, specially designed visualization would be helpful. Now, these are more likely to need some sketching and ideation with feedback and iteration. Let's see some examples. There are lots of useful techniques for visualizing data. Many of the most innovative depend on some kind of layering. Some UI stacks don't support layering. So if your legacy apps are using older technologies, such as Windows Forms, you won't have as much flexibility. But anything done in a browser with HTML5 has access to those capabilities. The first example here is, in fact, an HTML5 app. It shows a player's information on the website for the video game Halo 4. Note the team symbol in the back, then the armor configuration, then the rank on top of that. Again, lots of information packed into the space, but with good design, it doesn't feel crowded and does not overwhelm the user. Some layering examples are simple. The middle one on the bottom is a representation of a cattle pen. The shaded area is proportional to the percentage full, which is also given in precise numbers at the bottom. The symbol in the upper right indicates whether the pen has a roof. It might seem redundant to show how full the pen is in multiple ways, but the shaded part is easy to see on a casual scan. If there is a whole list of these pens, then the user can scan through the list and easily see which pens are full or relatively empty just with the shading. That's much faster than reading and interpreting the text and numbers. However, if they decide to use a pen for some new cattle, they might well need to know exactly how much space is available, and that detail is there when they need it. By the way, if you were wondering what the 1402 is for, that's the numerical ID of the pen. The top middle example is from the video game Civilization. It shows how a lot of important information can be packed in a tight space, although in this case, it's pretty packed and it does take some experience to know what it all means. Video games are a great place to get ideas for UX design because they have professional designers. After all, the only reason for the game is the experience, so it has to be a good one for the game to succeed. Layering numbers on top of symbols is becoming a commonly used technique. See the upper right, with numbers on top of the fuel tanks. The tanks are a good example of leveraging the user's domain knowledge in visualization. Everyone in the fuel industry knows what a propane tank looks like and what a fuel oil tank looks like. Working in some graphics that appeal to users is also a good signal to communicate to them that you have their needs in mind. Lots of examples can provide some inspiration, but it's easier to design good visualizations if you understand some fundamental design principles. These are based in the way the human visual system works. Here's an example of a design principle: Gestalt continuity and closure. It's based on the tendency of the human visual system to automatically fill in gaps. In the natural world, sometimes you don't see all of an object, so you need to recognize it with minimal visual information. You don't have to see the whole animal to know that it's a leopard. But moving beyond the natural world, the visual system fills in gaps. There's no rectangle in the top left graphic, but the visual system fills one in anyway. Same for the non-existent ball in the lower right. People with the right experiences will fill in the gaps on this graphic. It's another Halo reference, being a partial image of Master Chief. The fill-in-the-gaps capability makes it possible for things like icons to be fairly minimal, and this has impact upon data visualization. Once upon a time, GUI designers thought icons needed to be realistic looking, a school of design called skeuomorphic design, but that was left behind as we got better understanding of how users' visual systems work. Minimalist icons are still based on experience, though. I'm personally wondering whether the camera icon's going to hold up over time, since very few people take pictures with a camera now. The example on the right depends upon having seen or been exposed to a particular TV show. I think most of you probably know what it is. I thought it was a clever and evocative example of a minimalist icon. Here's an example from one of my projects, and a developer on the team came up with this. A legacy app would probably have a checkbox or something to indicate alive versus dead, but using symbols is faster to perceive and easier to learn. The upside-down cow sends a clear, immediate signal that the cow is dead. The cow icon is just an outline. But for the visual system, that's enough to quickly perceive that it's a cow. You don't have to pile on a lot of detail when doing graphical things in data visualization. I show lots of examples to help you build up some new capability in your minds. If those examples stick, there will be times that some of them surface when you're thinking about a problem in UX design, particularly data visualization. It doesn't matter that much if the examples are from new modern UI apps or just abstract examples. The main thing is that you internalize some of these examples to provide raw material for your own purposes as you try to improve your legacy apps. In fact, I hope from this point you'll pay more attention to apps on your mobile devices. They are often leading-edge designs, and particularly when you feel that an app appeals to you, you should take a bit of effort to figure out what kind of visualization techniques it used to be so appealing. This is a screen I showed earlier, and examples like this one may give you some ideas. This is from a total replacement, so you probably can't reach this level of modern look and feel with your legacy app, but you'll get more ideas for visualizing your own data if you see lots of examples. I talked a bit about it earlier, but I'll point out one layering example that I haven't mentioned yet. That bottom card view is for the most recent customer interactions. If you look carefully, you'll see that the background of each card has a graphic layered into it. That graphic corresponds to the type of interaction. Any guess what that first one with the wrench is about? Yeah, it's a service call. So having that in the background means, again, that the user can scan very quickly through a list and pick out the item that they are interested in and then kind of let their eyes drill down to get more information about that particular item. This is a good example from that same app showing how size can be used for information importance. Notice that the first tank has a larger font size for the percentage full. That's because the fuel is getting low and the user probably needs to notice that. The app has a threshold for when the font size gets bigger. That bar across the top is a common design technique to collect some of the most important information a user might need. In this case, it's things like how many days since the last delivery. You can get a sense of how better visualization helps the user by comparing these two ways of showing the same information. I've intentionally left off any significant cosmetics to focus just on the different visual impressions of a data grid versus a list view. This symbol right here on the left of these items corresponds to the type of event, making it easier and faster to scan for a particular event. We've seen some examples like that before, but some reinforcement is helpful because using shapes is not something that we naturally tend to do if our experience is centered on legacy apps. And I'd like to break you from the past on that and get you interested in using those kind of graphics and symbols to improve your designs. Sometimes data has a spatial aspect to it. In that case, showing data elements mapped to their real-world positions may make the data more consumable. The visual and cognitive system is optimized in people to make the connection between the mapped interface and the real world. And the more visual clues you can provide, the easier it is for users to see what they need to know. In this case, notice that extra work was done to give the planes a natural position at their respective gates. Modern UI technologies have capabilities known as transforms to allow rotation, reflection, and scaling of graphics, and this is an example of why they are useful. Remember me talking about the cattle management app? Here is an early version of their dashboard. It features all their cattle pens mapped out in an arrangement very much like the real arrangement, and with colorization to help quickly see the status of a pen. That example was another modern app example, using the latest technologies. But, as I've said before, you don't have to go all the way to that kind of app to make substantial improvements. Since you're coming from a legacy app, which probably uses data grids, you'll likely need to be fairly conservative about how radically you change how the app looks and behaves. Well, you can get some interesting capabilities without layering or fancy shapes or transforms. Just basic shapes and colors can do a lot. Here's a demo I did for a client about 12 years ago to show some possibilities. It was created to show how we could replace a data grid for a specific operation. Let me show it interactively. This data represents trucks carrying deliveries. Each truck can have multiple loads. I should probably note here that I rarely use actual production software for demos because that software is owned by my company's clients. Only screenshots of that software are usually available. But they're pretty open about some of the early design efforts, allowing me to show things that we tried. So that's the kind of demo I normally use, and this is an example. This is a classic parent-child data relationship. That's always been tricky to do in data grids. Many legacy apps use what's called a hierarchical data grid to do it, where plus signs next to a parent record open up child records below that record. I can tell you from many cases where this was done that most users find hierarchical data grids to be clumsy to use. Scanning to find the information you want is typically a challenge. This representation of the data looks superficially a bit like a data grid, though there is some stacking of related textual data. But the real difference is in that first column. Let me grab my blue arrow and point out. You see this column right here? That column represents the loads that are on a truck, that is, the child records. Each load is represented by a shape. The overall shape corresponds to the type of facility where the load will be delivered. A square, for example, could be a warehouse, while a circle was a dock, and a triangle was an office building, and you can see that a hover would be able to help the user find that sort of thing out. It actually doesn't take that much usage before the user is clued in to the usage of shapes like that. Learns to scan the shapes to see what's going on with the stops for a truck. The color, of course, indicates the time status, whether the loads are on time or not. So it's easy to see what trucks are at risk of a late delivery. Then, when detail on the loads is desired, they can be dropped down. So we might scan and see that one because we see that there are some loads that are in danger of being late. So we might want to look at the detail. I was playing around a bit here with the idea of showing the weight of the load with a bar, and I encourage you to think about that kind of possibility when you're doing your own designs. Basically, you would put whatever information was appropriate for the user to need in the drop-down there. That's much, much better than the typical extra rows in a hierarchical data grid because it brings together the child records in whatever way is appropriate. I also included another layer to show the possibility of including a map to the load's destination. Let's bring one of those up. Well, sorry, it came up on another monitor. I'll bring it over here. This is an example of another design principle called progressive disclosure, where information is presented in layers as needed. Let's close these down and finish off with an example that's a bit more out there. Let's get my arrow out of the way. There we go. It might be stretching beyond what some of you could do in your apps, but I like to help you stretch things a bit just to see how far you might be able to make things go. This example shows how layering can also be used to help users compare data. And the example leverages another design principle called Gestalt proximity. That principle says that the visual system automatically groups things together when they are close together. Combining that with translucent layering yields an interesting way to help users do comparison of two data sets. Here's a quick demo of the technique. In this demo, imagine we have two data sets from different time periods. Individual data elements have a maximum and a minimum. It could be high and low temperatures or high and low pulse rates or something like that. When you look at the data like this, you can tell that both time series generally decrease. But how does the overall trend for each period compare? That's not really practical to see at a glance. But suppose that we can overlay the two time periods. Those transform capabilities I talked about let us do that. Let's shift the right one on top of the left one. I use this lever right here to do that. Bring it right over and get it just something like that. Now it's easy to see that the right series is noticeably lower overall. Could you tell that your visual system shifted in its perception when the data elements started to overlay? That's Gestalt proximity at work. When data elements for a time period get close enough together, the visual system automatically considers them to be related to one another. Let's sort of take it off and put it back. See that again. As they come in and you start to see things overlap, now they are considered by the eye as a single group with related data rather than separate visual elements. The final area that I'll suggest for applying design to legacy apps is workflow. Legacy apps were typically built in stages over time, and it's very common for a user task to be carried out by going to several different places in the legacy app. If you have such cases, and you probably do, you may want to design a new workflow-based view as a supplement to the existing functionality. That makes users faster because they don't need to bounce around in the app so much. It's also easier for new users to learn. And in some cases, structuring the workflow helps users avoid errors that come from things like doing steps out of order. The way you would add a workflow view to a legacy app varies with the type of workflow it is. The simplest is to just bring together commonly used things that are currently scattered around the app. Those actions can be assembled into a hub and used independently from the hub. In that case, the hub might be a sort of home screen for users that use a particular set of functions. Think of someone answering the phone in a propane shop. There are 6 or 8 common actions that the person at the other end of the line wants to do, like schedule a delivery or a service call or whatever. A hub workflow would bring all those actions together in one place, though those actions might also be available through a more traditional menu. I'll show an example in a moment. The next type is more familiar. It's when steps must be done in a particular order. A wizard is an example of that kind of linear workflow. Finally, there is more complex branching workflow with queues of work items that go from person to person. I don't recommend trying this as an improvement in a legacy app because it touches too many things. It's more common to design this kind of workflow in a replacement app. I will touch on it briefly later. Here's a wireframe example of a hub workflow. In this case, it's for someone answering the phone at a utility billing office. You can see the 8 actions that would most commonly be used, along with some important information about the customer. While there are probably people around the office that don't need this because they know where to go in the app for each of these actions, they had to learn all that. Some new person answering the phone during lunch may not know all that and can benefit from being guided to the right place to take care of routine matters. You can often find the options that go on a hub with a brief survey or perhaps brainstorming with some users who are in the right role. You'll want to ask people something like the question I have listed there. When someone calls into the office, what are the most common reasons they call? I get surprised sometimes by the answers to this question. It never occurred to me that they get frequent calls when someone is closing on a property to find out the pending utility bills that have to be rolled into the close. But the users quickly let me know about that one, along with the more common ones, such as paying a bill or suspending service. Here's an example of a linear workflow with the steps stacked vertically. Each step expands to let the user handle that step. That might be done right inside the expansion, or the expansion could have a button to connect the user to the place in the app to do the step. Progress can be indicated by check marks. As I said, more complex workflows are not usually added to legacy apps, but when you do get to a point that a major section of a legacy app needs to be replaced, you should look at this type of workflow because it can dramatically improve productivity. We've seen cases of 40 to 50% improvement in throughput. However, unless you have a good architect experienced with workflow, you probably want to look at some outside help for this. An advanced workflow framework allows you to have very complex, extensible workflows. Such a framework allows you to add new work items, new queues, new routing rules in minutes or hours. This has enormous benefits for the business. But, as I admitted before, this kind of workflow needs so many hooks into other apps that it may not be practical to do in a legacy system, even if it would help. But if you happen to be someone who does think it might be a fit, I'd be happy to discuss it with you further. Finally, let's talk just a bit about adding a dashboard to a legacy app. A dashboard can be an easy improvement to an existing app because it generally stands apart from the other app functionality. The main point to keep in mind when designing one is that it can be about helping users manage tasks as well as presenting data. It can have panels with things like a list of incomplete orders that a user needs to work through, or outstanding customer service tickets. You also need to think about whether the same dashboard can be used by everyone, or if it needs to be customized by user. Dynamic dashboards, where a user can add what they need to it, usually add more value in a company with varied roles. Here's a static dashboard we did for a temporary staffing application all the way back in 2008. It combines some of the data-related information in the upper left with some panels for work that needs to be done. And in the one toward the bottom of the left side, you see the open jobs that could be filled with a temporary employee. And there are some action items in the panel over on the right. More recently, we did a dynamic dashboard for a Synergex customer who sells a commercial app. It's that one for propane management I referred to earlier. This one shows the top 10 overdue customers in the lower right, just as an example. But most of the stuff on here was just placeholder stuff during the design to show kind of aesthetically what the dashboard would look like. Let's spend a couple minutes talking about what you can do to prepare for getting into UX design to improve your legacy apps. You may remember from the beginning that I sometimes call that incremental design. Getting started with incremental design is easier if you understand some basic design principles. If you know how the visual system works, you know what to do and not do in designing search results, data visualizations, just about any kind of view, really. Also, the examples that illustrate principles can serve as a source of inspiration to generate ideas. There are video courses on this. I have a couple, and I also have a YouTube from a session I did in London a few months ago. It's a concise way to introduce developers to the idea of a design principle. It does focus on the principles based in the visual system, and there are other principles based in our cognitive systems, so if that kind of material is interesting, you'll want to go on to other videos or courses. As conventions change, legacy apps can begin to look stale. A complete fix usually involves platform change, but there are things you can do to spruce up a legacy app if your current UI technology allows it. Here are some examples. The convention for indicating whether something is on or off has changed as a result of mobile platforms. The sliding on-off switch is common on mobile, so everyone understands it. It's also more modern looking. Mobile also has encouraged cleaner views. If you have traditional tabs, for example, you might look at ways to clean up the tab cosmetics. Also, adding indicators to tabs is an underused technique. About data grids, I'm not an advocate of replacing all data grids, but the more modern the app, typically the less likely it is to have a lot of data grids. That's because modern UI has alternatives for some use cases that work better for the users. I hope I've demonstrated some examples of that. I showed a demo, for example, of that data grid replacement with the transportation loads. However, there are use cases where data grids are still the right fit. As I said earlier, data grids have some capabilities that make them better for certain user needs. It surprises me how often I see menus with tons of options, but no search capability to find an option. That's a fairly low-cost addition to a menuing system in almost any technology. So if you have more than, say, a few dozen options on your menu, you might want to add search to help supplement things you probably already have, such as categorization of the options. Sometimes it's the little things that help speed people up and reduce error. In our apps that we build, we often decorate dates during data entry of orders and trouble tickets and such. Let me show you what I mean. We put a label close to the date and change it for yesterday, today, and tomorrow. You could extend that to 1 week or things like that if you wanted to. But what we do is hide it for any other date. If someone enters a date they thought was today, but it's actually yesterday, they are more likely to notice that mistake when yesterday pops up under the date. Here's another hint related to sprucing things up. If you really start getting into this legacy improvement thing, you might want to make the newer parts stand out just a bit from the old. An easy way to do that is to change the typeface. I recommend some lightweight typeface such as Sego UI Lite on Windows. A lightweight typeface feels more modern. I mentioned my video courses earlier. Here are the QR codes for them. The top two are the ones that can help with your entry into applying more UX design. Though if you interview developers, that bottom one might be of interest. I feel compelled to mention that the Pluralsight course is 12 years old now, having been done in 2012. But I guess they don't have anything better because it still racks up a lot of views. It has a lot of that design principle material, 4.5 hours worth. I had one person who watched it call it Discovery Channel for developers. Well, that's it. I hope you've gotten some good ideas and strategies for improving your current legacy apps. You're welcome to contact me, of course, with questions or to discuss helping you through your design journey. I do 1 or 2 free web meetings each month for a company where I present on one of these topics for things like a lunch and learn or some other kind of professional development. Ping me if you'd like to reserve a slot for that. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. And now I think we're ready to move into some questions and answers.
Thanks, Billy, for your presentation.
Oh, you're welcome. I enjoyed building that presentation, and I'm looking forward to what questions people might have.
Yeah. I see there was a question earlier about what was the repository for the vector graphics. Looks like you provided that there.
Respond in the chat because I needed to post that link so
Got
that
it.
you can go there. I did not mention explicitly, but people are probably interested to know it's free, and you have to supply an email to get the code, etc., for the download. But they don't spam you. They're really, really good about that. I've been using Syncfusion now for about 10 years, and they're really nice about that. And it's kind of my go-to tool. But there are lots of other tools too to get vector SVGs. So I'm not saying don't use other tools. That just happens to be the one I use.
So you mentioned sketching out different design ideas for a screen. How do you know when you've got the right one?
Oh, that's a perennial problem. And to sort of set the stage again, I think you ought to try things and not just stop when you think you've got an idea. That if you do multiple competing ideas, particularly when you show them to users, then if you've got 2 ideas, 2 designs that they're looking at, you're going to get better feedback. I mean, if it's just one, they'll often sort of go, well, I think that should be moved there, and I don't like the colors. They'll get into trivia. So, but if you show them multiple design ideas, I like 3 if I can find 3, then you get a lot better feedback. So typically the users will key in on one, and they will start to guide you to the right one. Now, that doesn't mean you're done, though. After they have done that, after you've presented them with some ideas and they've kind of found their favorite, you still may want to go a little bit further, depending upon sort of your intuition about whether it's really as good as it could be. Go a little bit further and then go for another round back to the users and see if they like some of that better. Or during feedback sessions, they might very well give you suggestions for improvement of the designs, and you would need another round for that. A very common thing is to go, well, I really like this design over here, but there's that thing in that design there that really kind of, I like that. Could you find a way to transplant that over to other designs? So it's a matter of intuition, but feedback is what guides you into it. How do you go about testing concepts and designs with users, and how do you measure the feedback? Well, in large design projects where we're replacing entire apps, we do quite a lot of research up front. We do quite a lot of user observation, and we do quite a lot of testing of results and evaluation. Web people are fond of A/B type testing, and that's one interesting way to actually test in production. But ideally, we'd like to check out these designs without actually getting to the production phase. At that point, changes are kind of hard. So we typically test by building interactive prototypes that just, we kind of hack something together that demonstrates the visualizations and interactions that we think are most critical. And that it may be done in a prototyping tool. Figma is an example of one that people like to use. Or I'm an old XAML guy, so I do a lot of interactive stuff in XAML. And then when users see something that's interactive, you tend to get better feedback that way. So that and we typically like to do feedback to a certain extent in groups, that we might have 5 or 6 people, and see if the group comes to a consensus or not. Does the group sort of get onto one channel and feel like that's the right approach? Or is the group split between 2 different possibilities? In that case, it says, okay, we need to maybe talk to them some more and try out some new things and combine the best of both, or things like that. So a lot of that kind of feedback is done in these interactive groups. A caution, if you do that sort of thing, is you want users, ideally. You don't want managers to be a primary part of the feedback group. You can get feedback from managers, and that's good, and they'll give you valuable feedback. But the problem in having a manager and a group of people like that is that, depending on the group dynamics in that particular team, they may very well, when the manager says something, other people start to suppress their natural disagreement with things. So generally, if the manager really wants to come, I try to kind of keep them to just watch, to be observers of the process rather than active participants in it.
So longtime experienced users usually prefer that we don't change anything. How can we deal with that and still make constructive changes?
There's, in the design community, we have something called status quo bias. That basically is a shortcut way to refer to the fact that people like what they're comfortable with. And that is a continual problem. And unfortunately, the answer is counterintuitive. That means that when I give you the answer, a lot of people are going to go, no, that'll, I don't see how that could work. But it does. And you have to kind of take it on faith. When you are designing things, if you just trim around the edges, it actually turns out that you have a hard time getting people to accept your changes. That unless they see a lot of value in the redesigns that you're presenting, then they're just, we don't want to do it. Just give us what we got. So interestingly enough, ironically enough, being bold about your new designs is less risky and more likely to overcome status quo bias. And I say you have to take this on faith, but I've seen it many times, is that we work hard to come up with a better design for, like, search, for example. And when you come up with something that's clearly better and you put it in front of people and you see this reaction of, oh yeah, that's obviously the way to do it, of course. Now they lose their attachment to older stuff, and you don't have any trouble from that point refining the design forward. But that's a challenge. That means it's really up to you as a team to come up with designs that do have some clearly better aspects. They don't have to be perfect, but they have to be clearly better than what they have today. And in legacy apps, there, as I said, some of the areas like search and workflow and data visualization, it's relatively easy to come up with things that do have some significant improvements. So get your improvements in place first, and work with a smaller group of people that maybe you think are a little bit more flexible in accepting new designs, to get to a point of refinement where you can show it to a larger group and it's good enough that they go, oh yeah, we want that. Let me tell you, I've seen this over and over again. And Steve talks about Balsamiq, which is my partner's absolute favorite tool for wireframing prototyping. It's very simple to use. And one of the things I like about Balsamiq is that when you do wireframes in it, they have this sort of hand-drawn feel. They don't look polished. They don't look done. You actually get better feedback from that, because when people see that, they go, oh, well, this is just an idea. They feel free to comment on it and to critique it. Whereas if something looks too perfect and too done, they naturally feel like, even if you haven't, that you've put a whole lot of work in it. And now they're reluctant to criticize it, but when it's kind of looks hand drawn, that we find that really promotes very candid feedback. How much can you do with a traditional Synergy application on Windows or Unix? Well, that kind of depends on the details. A lot of traditional Synergy stuff is based on Windows forms, and there are ways to integrate some of the newer technologies like WPF as kind of slide-in pieces or pieces that the Windows form application might link to in some fashion. So there are some technological possibilities there. There are challenges, no doubt about it, but it kind of depends upon whether you feel like you're getting enough benefit from redesign. Because I've worked with so many companies that they let holdups like that prevent them from trying to move forward because the technical challenges. We've all got stuff to do, and there always seems to be work that's hanging out there. But the longer you wait, the more danger there is in not doing the application and coming forward. It kind of depends upon whether it's corporate application or commercial application. Commercial applications are particularly vulnerable to risk if you don't kind of keep up and take on the work of doing it. But even commercial applications, you can lose your competitive advantages to competitors in your space if your internal application doesn't do some of the more modern stuff that people have grown to expect. Let me mention. Do we have time for this? Yeah, we do. Let me mention one additional consideration because we've seen this in multiple cases. A lot of the applications, these legacy applications that you're talking about, have their roots back in the late 80s, early 90s, as companies were automating for the first time. This was their entry into automating. And as a result, things kind of organically grew instead of being planned out. And that introduces some obsolescence as the business has changed, et cetera. But the people who worked with it all the way through that time span typically have figured out ways to work with that legacy stuff and keep the business going. That they kind of know how to fill the gaps in because they have a whole lot of domain knowledge in doing that. And they have knowledge of those applications, stuff that isn't necessarily obvious when you walk up to it, but they've learned it over a long span